No one expected Peach's final moments to unleash a new nightmare, one so devastating that it shattered every fragile bond still holding the truth together. With a single letter written in the fading tremors of her last breath, she exposed a secret powerful enough to ignite suspicion, betrayal, and a horrifying revelation about Leslie that no one was prepared to confront. And the moment Ted's eyes traced those trembling lines, the path behind him vanished completely. A new storm rose. Darker, more volatile, and far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. This was no longer a story of loss. It was the moment every hidden truth erupted into chaos. Bill had always believed he understood danger. He had lived through betrayals disguised as kindness, survived storms born from the ambitions of others, and rebuilt himself from the quiet wreckage of every mistake he had ever allowed too close to his heart. But nothing had prepared him for the moment his brother arrived at Fairmont Crest, carrying with him an urgency that felt like the shadow of an unavoidable disaster. The tension in the air changed even before the truth was spoken, as though the world itself sensed an impending fracture, one that would not be easily mended once it split. His brother's arrival was abrupt, almost violent in its timing, crashing into the fragile, half-repaired structure of Bill's life the way a storm surge overtook a shoreline, sweeping away anything that wasn't anchored securely enough. Bill had spent weeks trying to silence the unease crawling under his skin, dismissing every instinct that warned him something was wrong. He wanted to believe Hayley's affection held no ulterior motive, that her presence in his home was anything other than a calculated intrusion. He convinced himself that the doubts forming in the back of his mind were consequences of stress, remnants of paranoia left over from the chaos surrounding Peach's final confession and the tangled secrets that still lingered in the shadows of those events. But when his brother stepped through the doors of Fairmont Crest, the quiet dread that Bill had tried to bury began clawing its way back to the surface. The warning struck him not as a possibility, but as an accusation, a blade slicing into the thin membrane of trust he had fought so hard to maintain. His brother didn't bring speculation, he brought certainty, and with it, a devastating collapse of everything Bill thought he knew. Hayley was not simply unpredictable. She was not merely emotionally volatile or driven by impulses she refused to acknowledge. She was a threat, and the evidence, subtle patterns, unexplained disappearances, inconsistencies in her behavior, sudden shifts in her demeanor, had been accumulating beneath the surface long before his brother arrived to expose it. Bill realized, with a sickening twist of recognition, that every small act of strangeness he had brushed aside had been another piece in a much darker design. As the weight of betrayal tightened around him, Bill felt an anger he had not known he was capable of. It was not the kind that erupted immediately, it was slow, cold, and deliberate, spreading through him like a toxin. His mind replayed every moment he had defended Hayley, every instance he had dismissed someone else's concerns, every time he had felt something was off but refused to follow the instinct that whispered warnings he didn't want to hear. The betrayal stung not only because Hayley had deceived him, but because he had allowed himself to become vulnerable to someone who had been quietly orchestrating his downfall. The sense of foolishness, more than the fear, ignited a deeper fury. But anger was not the only force tearing through him. Beneath it, a profound conflict began to fracture the foundation of Bill's identity. Part of him wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding, that the woman who had whispered promises of loyalty couldn't possibly be capable of such cruelty. Yet another part, the part shaped by years of observing human nature and the destructive lengths people went to protect themselves, knew that this was not only possible, but likely. He had seen it too many times, desperation breeding recklessness, fear fueling violence, jealousy twisting affection into something poisonous. Hayley, with her guarded expressions and unpredictable shifts in temperament, fit too neatly into that pattern to ignore the truth any longer. Hayley, meanwhile, sensed the shift long before she understood its cause. She felt the air in Fairmont Crest grow heavier, sensed the silent changes in Bill's demeanor, saw the hesitation in his movements, the small, almost invisible indicators that something was unraveling just out of sight. Her initial reaction was confusion, then fear, then a rising resentment she could no longer control. She had pushed too far, manipulated too much, and taken advantage of Bill's trust without considering how quickly it could all collapse. Even before she knew what had happened, she felt cornered, trapped in her own spiraling decisions. Her guilt twisted violently into defensiveness, feeding a darker part of her that refused to accept responsibility. Instead of acknowledging the consequences of her actions, she felt wronged, exposed, and betrayed by the discovery she never intended Bill to learn. Every step she took became frantic, fueled by a desperation to regain control of the situation, even as she sensed it slipping irreversibly from her grasp. She began spiraling into emotional chaos, her thoughts clouded with fear of losing everything she believed she deserved. Bill's brother watched the unraveling from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with the grim understanding of someone who had seen this kind of destruction before. He had never intended to interfere in Bill's life, never planned to return to Fairmont Crest, a place he associated with old wounds and unresolved memories. But when he uncovered what Hayley was planning, when he saw the signs of poisoning, the subtle manipulations, the carefully orchestrated isolation, he knew there was no moral choice left except to intervene. Protecting Bill wasn't a duty, it was the only option his conscience would allow. As the truth detonated silently between them, the house seemed to transform into a battleground of suppressed emotions. Bill felt the walls closing in, as though the entire structure of Fairmont Crest had become a reflection of his fractured trust. He replayed every moment with Hayley, searching for the precise point where affection had turned into manipulation. The realization that she had been slowly eroding his stability, introducing toxins in ways he hadn't recognized, filled him with a sense of violation that ran deeper than anger alone. It became a wound, raw and burning. Hayley's internal world collapsed into panic. She began to spiral, replaying every action she had taken, each one becoming sharper and more incriminating in her mind. She felt her options narrowing to nothing. Her fear morphed into resentment, pushing her toward reckless, irrational thoughts. Instead of guilt, she felt survival instinct taking control, driving her toward even darker plans as she imagined everything she was about to lose. The more desperate she became, the more dangerous her decisions turned, forging a path that dragged everyone deeper into the consequences of her unraveling mind. Bill's brother remained the only stable force in the storm. He watched the clash of guilt, fear, and rage as though bracing for the inevitable. He understood that the truth might break Bill, but it was better than allowing Hayley to continue hiding her intentions beneath her fragile facade. He had seen this kind of person before. Individuals who wrapped themselves in vulnerability to mask the harm they inflicted. He knew that if he had waited any longer, the damage would have been irreversible. As tension escalated, Bill found himself caught between conflicting impulses, anger and grief, betrayal and longing, denial and recognition. The battle inside him was relentless. He wanted to confront Hayley, demand answers, force clarity from a situation that refused to give him anything but chaos. But he also knew that confronting her too soon could push her into dangerous territory. The decision weighed heavily on him, a burden that grew heavier with each passing moment. Hayley, consumed by fear of exposure, began making choices that pushed her further away from redemption. Her emotions spiraled into volatility, and her desperation became a weapon she wielded blindly. She felt trapped and blamed everyone but herself for the situation closing around her. The more she attempted to regain control, the more erratic and dangerous her behavior became. By the time night fell over Fairmont Crest, the house had transformed into a crucible, a space where every suppressed emotion, every buried truth, every fracture in trust rose violently to the surface. Bill carried the weight of betrayal like an anchor around his chest, while Hayley fought against her own collapsing world with a panic that threatened to ignite into something catastrophic. Bill's brother braced himself for impact, knowing the confrontation was inevitable and that the fallout would leave none of them untouched. In that moment, each character stood at the edge of a precipice of their own making. Their choices, their secrets, their fears, and their tangled loyalties had fused into a singular, volatile force that could only move in one direction, toward destruction. The question was no longer whether the truth would come out, but how many pieces they would be left in once it did.